Welcome to the United States of Tiffany. Our commentary offers a humorous take on wrestling. Please note, we're not bullying or attacking the wrestlers. We're engaging with the choreographed sport and its storylines. Our jokes and observations are about the characters and storylines, not the real people behind them. Tourists and citizens alike, welcome. Enjoy the show, and remember, it's all in good fun.
Okay, y'all. Let me get my microphone together. Okay. I hope I'm not echoing. There we go. Happy Valentine's Day to everybody. If you celebrate it, I do not, but I don't knock those who do. So happy Valentine's Day to you. We're going to read some more of the Black History book today. It was a fun time last time. It's going to be a fun time this time. All right. So let me get my light. Thank you, Kira. Hello, Nika. Hi, Caleb. You're still here. Hello. Now, I promised everybody that came in today, if they wanted to talk about something else before we got started into reading, that we could. So I'm gonna leave it. We're gonna wait before we start reading. Let me double check and make sure that the ads aren't on. Yeah, I don't have no ads on today. Okay, cool. So, is there anything wrestling related that y'all want to talk about before we get into the book? Numbers went up real quick. No takers. All right. Oh, it's a big salad. Okay. Okay. I gave everybody opportunity to ask me questions before we dive into this. And I got no takers. So I don't want nobody mad. Talking about I got a question. Is wrestling related? Okay, but I waited. Now, the last time we talked, or rather read, we stopped at chapter 1 of the Black as Fuck history book. It is chapter 2, and chapter 2 is called The Church Fight That Started Slavery. Not a church fight. So, let's get into it, shall we? Let me take the cover off the book. It's causing some discomfort. There we go. Chapter 2, The Church Fight That Started Slavery. There are entire books about the history of European religion, social caste systems, and how Europeans turned the African continent into a factory for raw human material. But to understand the origins of America's constitutionally enshrined human trafficking system that legally reduced people to chattel, we must go back to the inception of the transatlantic slave trade that formed the foundation of America's color-based social hierarchy. It started at church. The church. After a little-known woodworker named Jesus died, Christianity began trending in Europe. Long before the conservative Christian movement co-opted the idea of using Christianity for the purpose of expanding a political base. Sound familiar? The Roman Empire thought it might be a good idea to combine church and state for the sake of politics and world domination. The Holy Roman Empire eventually fell, but the idea of using God's infallible human intercessor, the Pope, as a political leader continued, making the Catholic Church the most powerful institution in Europe. The Vatican had its own army, settled disputes between countries, and even negotiated treaties. In 1054, what's that? For yourself?
No.
They had this much chicken in the salad. It was this much in there. This is a lot of smoothie.
I missed every damn thing. Because they wanted to show the Olympics at prime time. They taped all the NBA stuff early and then put it on at 5 o'clock. So now I gotta hope the Peacock put it up there and I can watch the replay later. I want to see Donovan won the damn 3-point shootout.
Can I have a cup to pour this in? Because it's just inconvenient to sit open like this. Hold on, y'all. We're gonna finish reading in a sec.
And made me mad.
Mom informed me. Yeah. I just need some protein.
You put some of your protein powder right here.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
it's okay. When you come back upstairs, I'll tell you what I need or what I can eat. Because I have some. Anyways, sorry, y'all, for the delay. My apologies. I apologize, y'all. Let's get back to it. All right. Let's start here with the Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire eventually fell, but the idea of using God's infallible human intercessor, the Pope, as a political leader continued, making the Catholic Church the most powerful institution in Europe. The Vatican had its own army, settled disputes between countries, and even negotiated treaties. In 1054, the Church split into two factions: the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, each controlling different parts of the European continent. As it relates to our story, all you need to know is this. Since 711, North African, and Arab Muslims known as Moors controlled different parts of Al-Andalus or the Iberian Peninsula, which was home to the countries we now know as Spain and Portugal. To get control of their respective homelands, Spanish and Portuguese nobles assured the Pope that the Latin Church would see an increase in tithes and offerings if the Church supported the Reconquista, the 400-year-old struggle to rule the Iberian Peninsula. The papacy jumped at the chance to expand its territory and gain some revenue. So, in 1123, the Pope, I'm going to say that it's Pope C because I can't say this man's name. I put it on in the chat box so y'all can see. Let me see if I can pull it up. This is this man's name. We're going to call him Pope C. Okay? Not to be confused with Pimp C. So in 1123, Pope C proclaimed that the Reconquista was a part of the Crusades, a series of religious wars to control the Holy Land and make non-Christians disappear. That sounds very familiar.
What you need for it?
Just the turkey and the wraps out of there. The tortillas. That sounds real familiar, don't it? So just get the tortilla. Just put me like a slice or two in a wrap. During this constant conflict between the Christian and the Islamic kingdoms, Africans, Eastern Europeans, and Asians were all subject to varying forms of servitude. Although slavery existed during this time, it was never exclusively race-based, nor was it as widespread and entrenched as it would become in the Americas. By the time Spain and Portugal reconquered their homelands in the early 1400s, centuries of warfare had left both countries in dire financial straits. Meanwhile, other European countries had emerged from the Dark Ages, finished their crusades, and revitalized their economies. If Portugal or Spain had any chance of existing alongside their European counterparts, they both needed new sources of income, and the best way to do that seemed to be through gaining control of the peninsula. This is interesting. This land grab spawned an intense rivalry with the likes of which wouldn't be experienced again until the dawn of Prince and Michael Jackson debate. After John VIII and his sons took control of Portugal from the Moors, he was crowned king, but he still had to figure out how to curry favor with the pastor by putting a little extra in the offering plate. Because Portugal was essentially a new country, they didn't have a great credit score, and their options were limited. Luckily, King John's son Henrique was obsessed with two things: boats and Africa. In 1415, when he was just 21 years old, Henrique had disguised himself in battle when he helped capture the North African city of Ceuta, which was slowly becoming an important trading outpost for Portugal. After the siege, Henrique heard stories that Africa was rich in gold and treasure and unsophisticated Africans. Hank wasn't even thinking about the slave trade at that time. He had a simpler idea. Instead of expanding their territory through warfare, what if they found new unexplored territories and just took the resources and the land from the African savages? Seemed easy enough, but there were one problem: monsters. During the Middle Ages, the bravest white adventurers would embark on voyages for the sake of honor, glory, and obviously money. Back then, items weren't locally available, were highly coveted, especially pelts, precious metals, and spices. In the event that these seasoned salt seeking seafarers it's funny. Didn't return home, most people assume the fearless travelers must have run into some kind of undefeatable beast. A story bolstered by the fact that every time European settlers tried to explore West Africa's coast, they were never able to make it farther than North Africa's Sahara Desert. It had to be monsters, right? What else could a but a saber-toothed leviathan could defeat those gallant pathfinders when rickety ships? I don't know. Undeterred, Henrique sailed off to figure out where the Africans trading in the North African province of Setua were getting all this gold. By time and time again, he failed miserably on his mission to make it there. I hope y'all can hear me. Let me put it on my book. Maybe you can hear it better. All right, cool. How was Portugal going to satisfy Europe's most vital institution, the Catholic Church? If he didn't have a pot of gold, if he didn't have figure something out quick, the church might just let his neighbors in Spain take over. Then Henrique would got another idea. Cultural appropriation, of course. For centuries, African Coptic sailors had borne sailing in smaller boats. Apologies. They had been sailing in smaller boats called lateens with triangular sails instead of big ships with old school square sails used by the Europeans. Henrique asked one of those African servants captured by during the Reconquista how to build these ships and avoid sea beasts. After the servant laughed for 45 minutes at the captor's belief that a gang of oceanic gremlins were out there taking down ships, he informed them that the sea things weren't killing white people. It was the wind. Using this new knowledge, Henrique assembled a few local cartographers to draw new maps. Instead of charting the land and the seas, Henrique's boys drew charts of the ocean currents and cornered the exploring market by mastering the trade winds. By the time Henrique was in charge of the Portuguese version of the Knights Templar and appointed Grand Master of the Military Order of Christ on May 25th, 1420, he had taught a generation of Portuguese sailors how to maneuver ocean currents in these new lateen rigged caravels, earning a name that would last forever: Prince Henry the Navigator. In 1441, Henry sent two knights, Nuno Trieste and Ateo Goncalves, off in their late model Portuguese ships to explore Africa and see what they could find. While filling his boat with seal pelts, Goncalves ran across a naked African and his Berber female servant. The first native Africans Goncalves had encountered in his 20 years of exploration. So, of course, he kidnapped them. I'm going to call this man G because I'm having a hard time pronouncing his name. When G met up with Tristiano's boat, I'm going to call him T, the, the two had decided to, if T's African servant, who just happened to be with them, could interpret the unclothed black prisoner's language and tell them where the gold was. The captured African basically told his kidnappers that he wouldn't be driving a camel if he knew where to find gold. He pointed the knights toward a nearby fishing camp, and the sailors then took 10 Africans this time, including the chief, figuring one of them had to know where they to find some gold. All right. The next day, the brilliant but bloodthirsty white knights used the naked captives to lure African savages into the open. G and T were shocked to find themselves ambushed by 150 Africans who opened a can of African whoop ass on the Portuguese warriors. T ran back to his ship and kept sailing south to search for gold. But G was shook. He decided to head back to Portugal with his seal skins and the 10 captives. By the time T returned to Portugal, G had already sold the seal skins and was prepared to split the profits from the expedition with T. T was astonished to see at his share of the take, wondering who his partner had bamboozled into paying such an exorbitant amount for a shipload of monk seals. The bulk of the money hadn't come from the seals, though. G explained most of the duo's profits came from the human cargo. In 1442, when Henry sent G on another expedition, G brought the African chief along, figuring he could ransom the chief back to the Africans. Sure enough, in exchange for the African abductee, G received a big stash of ostrich eggs. Don't ask. A small amount of gold dust and an oxhide shield. Finally, an African negotiator brought out 100 men, women, and children in a parade and allowed G to choose any 10 in exchange for the chief. The next year, T returned, but this time, instead of ransoming or kidnapping his human cargo, he bartered for 14 of the village's captives and resold them in Portugal. In 1444, the Portuguese discovered it was easier to barter for their human cargo than to capture them. And with that started an entire new economy, one of stealing human souls. T and G can go down in history as the first Europeans to purchase Africans from black slave traders and resell them in Europe. When Henry heard about the sale, he was no longer interested in the ostrich eggs, the seal pelts, or the spices. He wanted to know more about the people trading thing. But Henry didn't clear this practice with the church and didn't know what the Pope would think. Sure thing, they had enslaved Moors, Jews, and non-Christians during the Crusades. But that was a military thing, not a pure cash grab. When explaining his rationale to the church, Prince Henry would argue that technically he wasn't an enslaver because true Christians would never do that. Instead, he allowed Portuguese missionaries to save Africans from converting them to Christianity. The argument worked. By 1446, more than 30 Portuguese ships had filled applications with Prince Harry for people stealing licenses. In 1455, Pope Nicholas V granted Henry a monopoly on the African market as long as they baptized their cargo. Great. Henry had finally found gold in Africa. Portugal's only problem was that it was a hassle to sail to Africa, snatch up some humans, travel back past Portugal, and then sell the stolen Africans in Western Europe. Plus, there wasn't really a big demand for African labor in Europe because the market was flooded. The Moorish indentured servants and the remnants of feudalism. But with the age of the empire building came the need for labor. Explorers could discover land and soldiers could conquer kingdoms. But if Henry could commodify the labor necessary to build and maintain these empires, he would control a commodity more precious than any mineral or spice. So a year after G brought the Africans back to Portugal, Henry set up the Casa de Guinea. This state-run commercial entity would essentially become the prince's version of Amazon, a one-stop shop for goods imported from Africa, especially Africans. For the next 50 years, the Casa de Guinea would import around 1,000 Africans per year to sell to willing slave makers around the world. 1 second, y'all. Got to take a quick break, and I'll be back to finish reading up chapter 2.
Still don't know my words, still stressing perfection. Let you all in my mental, got me looking too desperate. Damn, you ain't desire.
of finding peace. Honestly, that sound like a fair trade to me. Rolling 80 wheels in a city. Riding on you. Gotta roll over to you, gotta give and release. Spread your legs downtown, so I'm going out to eat. Hit the raw sounds when I rock up in your sleep. I'ma roll on the forever, let her roll on me. Split this one down the middle.
All right. So let's get into it. Portugal continued to rule the seas for years after Henry the Navigator's death, sparking a less than friendly rivalry with its Spanish neighbors and earning the undivided attention of all of Europe. Businessmen and ambitious explorers from around the world found themselves in Portugal trying to make a living on Portuguese ships that benefited from his charting of the oceans. Because of this exploration and colonization, the Portuguese Empire eventually stretched from Europe to Japan, covering South America, Africa, and the Caribbean. Despite the African continent offering every natural resource in the world, because Portugal led the way in human trafficking, African bodies became the key to European expansion in the New World. And perhaps no one is more responsible for the 400-year competitive empire-building race than Henry the Navigator, whose advancement in exploration and charting the world's sailing routes made Portugal the first modern European empire. Okay, maybe there was one guy. While Portugal was filling up the church's coffers within the lucrative spice trade and the African resources raiding market, Spain struggled financially. It tried to emulate Portugal's success on the seas, but Portugal always seemed to beat it to the rich African ports. The two countries had never gone to war before a while, hadn't gone to war for a while, a war that ended with Portugal pulling a brilliant move. On September 4th, 1479, after the two countries had fought for 5 years over which royal family should be run the Iberian Peninsula and own the African coast. Okay, I had to tell Jared to come get it because I don't know where he put it. It's in here somewhere. Ask him if he has some because I gave him a bunch of them. Oh, Lord. All right. Sorry. I have to start over. On September 4th, 1479, after the two countries had fought for 5 years over which royal family should run the Iberian Peninsula and own the African coast, Portugal had to admit that Spain had won and ceded their rule on part of the peninsula to Queen Isabella and her husband Ferdinand. In exchange, the defeated Portuguese rulers asked the Spanish for just one thing. Portugal only wanted exclusive ownership of everything they discovered on the high seas. Spain could have the rest. The Spanish quickly signed the deal and laughed all the way to the bank, as Portugal hung its head, stifling its own chuckles. Isabella, Spain's new queen, felt empowered and protected by the attorney Reis, the church ratified deal that made Spain's royalty the eternal ruler of the peninsula, except for the relatively small sliver of Portuguese land. She didn't care about those tiny driving Portuguese idiots. They were probably going to get devoured by monsters anyway. And all Portugal managed to get in return for this deal was everything else in the world. According to the treaty that was ratified by the church, Portugal now owned the entirety of the Great Sea Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and everything in it, all the way to India. All of Africa now belonged to Portugal, as long as they could get past the sea dragons. This also meant that Portugal owned in 1479, nothing else existed in the Atlantic Ocean besides Europe and Africa. Of course, there was that weird guy who kept coming around talking about sailing west to India. That guy was crazy, right? This strange guy wasn't wealthy, smart, or talented, but he had started working on Portuguese ships at the age of 10, even though he was Italian and had absorbed everything the Portuguese seafarers taught him. He considered himself to be Portuguese at heart because he was obsessed with Henry the Navigator, who was already dead, and eventually married a noblewoman from Portugal. Noble women love sailors. Ask Popeye. The guy had been telling anyone who would listen that he could find a path to India by sailing west, away from Africa, which is unheard of. The nascent navigator drew up a few rudimentary maps, charted a course, and applied to King John II of Portugal's court for a sponsorship to explore 3 times. But Johnny Jr. repeatedly told the passionate ocean pioneer that his maps were wrong. King Henry VII of England also said no. Desperate, the obsessed sailor headed to Spain, where he ran into a fellow Italian who had just moved to Spain to work as a banker. The banker was a smooth talking geography nerd. He told the sailor that his maps were wrong, but as the banker and the sailor became friends, they discovered that they had the same obsessions. Eventually, the banker revealed that he wasn't just a banker. He was in Spain working for one of the wealthiest families in Europe. The Medicis. The banker made a deal. If the sailor could get someone to buy ships for the voyage, the banker would get his bosses to finance everything else. But where would the explorer get ships? Luckily, there was one person willing to bet on a strange sailor off the word of a geography nerd. Spain's new queen, Isabella. You see, Isabella was still screaming over the fact that her rivals now owned an entire ocean and everything in it. She doubted that the weird sailor could sail west to India, but it would solve all of Spain's problems if he could. Portugal had just discovered a long path to India by sailing around Africa, which meant Spain's Spanish, which meant the Spanish crown's days were numbered if Portugal controlled Africa and India. Isabella desperately needed a way to get even the playing field, and the only way that she could do that was to find more territory. It was a long shot, but even if the guy didn't find a western passage to India, what was the worst that could happen? Besides, the underwater Godzilla, that is. So Isabella wrote a check for a factory refurbished ship and 2 pre-owned caravels, and they made it out to the sailor. One, Christopher Columbus. Well, he didn't find India. On August 3rd of 1492, Christopher set sail for India. He first spotted land in the modern-day Bahamas and explored Cuba before wrecking one of his ships on the coast of the modern-day Haiti. During his initial voyage, Columbus noted that the Indians were so primitive that he could conquer the whole of them with 50 men and rule the land as he pleased. You might want to stick a pin in that. Columbus knew that Isabella hated slavery, but since her army had already captured much of the Iberian Peninsula, she had soldiers to spare. These conquistadors would have no problem dominating these island people, Columbus figured. When Columbus returned, he pulled into a rest stop in Portugal and discovered that he had just happened to park his boat right next to King Johnny Jr.'s vessel. Incredibly, the previous sentence is not a joke. Excuse me. Knowing that everything in the Atlantic Ocean belonged to Portugal, the sailor initially kept the news of his discovery from the king. By the time the information wafted through the Iberian Peninsula, Junior had already filed a claim arguing that the newly discovered land belonged to Portugal. His skilled cartographers had charted a course to this place that no one had ever seen, and as it turns out, their maps were accurate. Both sides went to the new pope to settle the dispute. Junior argued that this place was called the West Indies, was not actually in India, and since papal decrees were essentially the word of God, since the islands were in the Atlantic Ocean, the land legally belonged to Portugal. On the other hand, Isabella argued that God's representatives didn't even know about the islands when those treaties were made. Therefore, the Columbus territories belonged to Spain. To settle the controversy between the churchgoers, on May 4th, 1493, Pope Alexander VI drew an arbitrary line on a map. He declared that everything west of the line, including the islands discovered by Columbus, belonged to Spain. Since Portugal already owned Africa, the papacy decided that east of the line still belonged to Portugal. The only problem with this deal is that there wasn't anything east of the imaginary line besides Africa. A year later, the Treaty of Tordesillas, I think that's how you say it, sorry if I'm messing it up, officially sealed the decision. Isabella essentially had used Portugal's old tricks to win ownership of the West Indies. Spain quickly dispatched an army of conquistadors to ravish the Caribbean islands of gold, spices, and natural resources, which helped them gain favor with the church. However, Portugal only had a small population and a meager land army with which it could colonize its expanding empire. But of course, it owned Africa, and Henry the Navigator had created a literal corporate infrastructure for buying and selling Africans. Although Columbus's friend had lost a lot of money in his investment in the voyage, he recognized that Columbus had made a contribution, but he wasn't convinced Columbus should get all the credit. After all, it was mostly the banker's idea. Theoretically, he should be the famous, as just as famous as Columbus, but how could he convince the public? So the banker went to the Portugal's new ruler, King Manuel I. Like great uncle Henry the Navigator, Manuel the Fortunate was all about exploration and expansion. Manuel, however, wasn't worried about Spain's exploration of the West Indies. He was content to let Spain have a few islands in the middle of nowhere because in 1498, Portuguese explorers had finally found a sea passage to India. On the way back, the Portuguese Armada had even found an island east of the Pope's infamous line. Still, Manny wasn't impressed by the banker's knowledge of the geography, especially when the banker detailed his previous expeditions to the West Indies. The banker showed Manuel charts and maps of places that no one had ever seen. The slick-tongued financier even wrote 2 books detailing his travels that became extremely popular in Europe. Enchanted by the tales, Manuel convinced the banker to quit banking and join a Portuguese expedition as the armadas of official cosmographer. There was only one problem. The banker was lying. He was a banker. It's not like he studied atlases. He bought from gas stations or downloaded from Google Maps. Accurate maps were treasured back then. And this smooth talking banker bamboozled Manny into believing he had charted the known world, even though he didn't. He even knew how to pilot out a ship. He didn't. Half of the expeditions he told King Manuel about were totally made up. Still, Manuel fell for it and put the banker in charge of the Portuguese Armada's next trip. During their journey, the crew slowly realized that their cosmographer didn't know anything about cosmography and had hardly been on a ship in his life. For instance, when the explorers discovered a river on January 1st of 1502, the banker didn't even know he was in charge of naming things. So he just called it the January River or Rio de Janeiro. As for the new land, later merchants looked around and recognized a tree growing in abundance, the Brazil wood, and began referring to the new island by its most abundant export, the land of Brazil. Well, this is quite interesting, isn't it? Hey, Don. They found me. It's stuck. By the time the expedition returned to Portugal, the banker's ruse was up. The crew realized that he didn't know anything about navigating. In fact, the banker was so terrible at his job that more experienced navigators had to explain that they hadn't been island hopping. They were exploring one giant last landmass. The banker still couldn't let Columbus one up him, so he ran back to Spain and started spreading the rumor that Portugal had found a new continent, all because of him. He even produced a letter that most historians now believe was a hoax, which gave him credit for everything on the official Portuguese map, including the new continent and its banal name, the New World. After Christopher Columbus died in 1506, the banker began spreading the idea that he had taught Columbus everything he knew about exploring, and the public started to buy it. In 1507, someone took all the geographic information from Henry the Navigator, Portuguese explorers, and the late Christopher Columbus and combined it into one atlas, the Introduction to Cosmography. The book was meant to accompany a mass produced wall map and globes. It had no new information and held no historical significance, except for the fact that it published that fake letter from the banker, and the author suggested a new name for the New World. I see no reason why anyone could properly disprove of a name derived from that of Amerigo, the discoverer, a man of a sagacious genius. A suitable form would be a marriage, meaning land of Amerigo, or America. Dun dun dun. We've discovered how we've gotten our name for our continent. Isn't it marvelous, children? It's marvelous. So far, we learned that Spain and Portugal were going at it for a while, trying to one up each other and control the Iberian Peninsula. When they finally were able to come to an impasse about this peninsula, one side got what they wanted, or so they thought, and the other side got to control everything else. Once Spain realized that Portugal had a corner on the market, they began to try to find a way to circumvent Portugal. Portugal had a way of navigating the seas that nobody else knew how to do. So, because of that, Spain had to figure out how to regain an upper hand and be able to leverage what their knowledge was to get their money up. Okay? Because they were like, look, we've been fighting this other country, and bitch, we about to be poor. We got to figure out a way to get some money over here. Now, we know about the little Italian, aka Portuguese traveler, Columbus, living his best life and doing his thing. However, an idiot will beget an idiot. He did not know exactly where he was, and he did not have the knowledge to really be able to explore so that he can, one, document what he found, and two, understand exactly where he was. He was on the right path that they should sail west, but sailing west would not take you to India. I don't know why he thought that going west would take you to India. I'm very confused by that. But I guess he figured there was only they had to come by it somehow. And as we're learning, there was another man, a banker, who decided that Christopher Columbus didn't deserve all of the credit. In fact, he deserved the credit because it was his idea. So he started to try to erase Christopher Columbus and everything that he did, quote unquote, and make it so that it was all his own. What we're learning now about the colonizers is that they were very much shysters. They were people who would trick, steal, and thieve to get what they wanted. They didn't always lack intelligence, but they didn't feel like they needed to use it in a way that would help everyone. They only looked out for themselves. And when they felt like somebody else was getting credit that they felt like they deserved, they would do everything in their power to cut them down or get rid of them. Which doesn't sound too far off from where we are right now in this world. We also learned how everything was named, from America to Brazil to the West Indies. We know that some of these names came from happenstance, not from discoveries or people actually caring about what they saw. This was just a means to an end. So let's finish this chapter, shall we? So they referred to the island by its most abundant export, the land of Brazil. And it stuck. By the time the expedition returned to Portugal, the banker's ruse was up. The crew realized that he didn't know anything about navigating. And in fact, the banker was so terrible at his job that more experienced navigators had to explain that they hadn't been island hopping. They were exploring one giant landmass. We read this part. 3 decades later, Gerardus Mercator's, Lord have mercy, Gerardus Mercator's influential map would name the North and South continents after the charlatan Amerigo Vespucci, even though he had done nothing. Vespucci's name would be entrenched in history, making his namesake the perfect one for a country built on deception and lies. You see what I mean? By the early 1500s, the crown had profited dramatically from Columbus's exploration. In 1503, Isabella created the Casa de Contracción, a trading corporation that was essentially the Spanish version of the Casa de Guinea. Isabella put Vespucci in charge of its maps, pilot training, and ship licensing in 1508. Spain was mining copper and gold and farming sugar in their new colonies in Hispaniola, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and throughout the Caribbean. The conquistadors forced the indigenous islanders into servitude and killed those who didn't submit. But in 1512, the Catholic priest convinced King Ferdinand to pass a set of regulations that officially forbade enslaving colonial natives. The laws of Burgos originated from the Catholic friars, who disliked the inhumane treatment. The priests wrote damning letters and pleading sermons, suggesting that the Spanish would convert the new Indians to Christianity instead of abusing them. The priests' protests didn't matter. The indigenous people were dying anyway. The natives had no natural immunity to European illnesses, so entire Caribbean populations died from diseases. Hispaniolas, native Taino population went from 500,000 to 200 in less than 50 years because they were literally allergic to white people. Jesus Christ. It took 40 years for 90% of Cuba's population to disappear. Puerto Rico took 30 years. But those priests were not altogether altruistic in their protests. This was not about human rights. They fully understood that building an entirely new society required human subjugation. Nearly all of them agreed that there was a better way to go about colonizing the new world. Take a guess at where they wanted to go. Just run it through your brains. Just a little bit. African slaves. Desperate, the Spanish colonizers took the priest's advice and brought African slaves to the New World. But because Portugal still owned the African human being market, the first Africans in the Spanish colonies were actually brought from Portuguese traders, enslaved on the Iberian Peninsula, and then hauled as cargo to the New World. The Spanish believed that these Africans would be immune to European diseases and sturdier. They were partially right. Meanwhile, Portugal was making a fortune from harvesting the Brazil wood, trees, and growing sugar in Brazil. Then Portugal discovered an actual gold mine in Brazil. South America turned out to be a profitable investment. But how was Portugal's small population supposed to colonize 2 continents and extract the resources of an entire new world? The answer brings us back to T and G. Remember when T and G purchased the first batch of humans? When the African negotiator paraded out the prisoners, those 150 captives, including Europeans, Jews, Berbers, and some Africans. As a devout Christian, G knew the church wouldn't appreciate him bringing Muslims back to Portugal after ousting the Moors from the peninsula. The Europeans already likely had their own religion, as did the Jews. But G figured that the darker Africans would be less likely to flee captivity, would work harder, and be easier to convert to Christianity. One simple-minded decision would later be reinforced by Henry the Navigator's rules. Catholic decrees, the Casa de Guinea's rudimentary version of corporate regulations and stereotypes that would last until this very day. G scanned the diverse parade of prisoners and asked himself which ones would make the best slaves, and he chose the black ones. That was the end of chapter 2, ladies and gentlemen, and we've got some questions. Christopher Columbus did not discover. This is multiple choice. You tell me your answer. A, Christopher Columbus did not discover America. B, he did not consider himself to be Italian. C, he did not know what he was doing. And D, all of the above. Put it in the comment section. Question number 2. Who is responsible for slavery? Is it A, Henry the Navigator? B, T and G? C, white people? Or D, every society has slavery, plus the Africans sold slave too. Why must you make everything about race? Hey, Ryan. Hey, Ryan, guess what? They've got a question in here for you with an answer. You should get this book. They're talking to you. Oh, goodness. You can't find them?
We had a baggie with a minute.
What happened to the box?
Then we put the box away.
Yeah, I know where it's at. You can go sit down.
Okay.
My bad, JJ.
Yep, that's fine.
Junior, here, come take that to grandma. Kira, you are absolutely correct. The answer to the first question is D, all of the above. Our last question is, the new discoveries were called the New World because, 1, it was new to white people. 2, the people in the old world weren't good at naming things. 3, the world only consists of places white people conquered. Or D, it wasn't. I'll let you decide what the answer to that is. Here are some key terms you should take away from this particular chapter. The term African, people from the continent of Africa except for Egypt, Morocco, and any place that conquered or civilized a European country. Unlike their white counterparts, Africans are not separated into distinct cultural, geographical, or political groups unless they are from Egypt, Morocco, or a place that conquered or civilized. No, those are the only flavors that are
There's
in
only
there.
flavors that are in the box.
Okay.
All right. All right.
I know I gave her more than just that. Why when I start reading, everybody want to start tripping? Every time. Yeah, it's just, oh, here's go. Kiwi strawberry. Boom. Okay, y'all. We're going to get to chapter 3. Gonna take a quick break.
Still don't know my worth, still stressing perfection. Let you all in my mental, got me looking too desperate. Damn, you ain't desired. Time. If I say I hate you, I mean it. If I say I love you, I mean it. If I say I hate you, I mean it. If I say I love you, I mean it.
If I ever heard one, and I'm still here outside, front line, south side. I've been losing friends and finding peace. Honestly, that sounds
Here, Junior.
fair to me.
This is for Grandma. All right, we're moving on to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is called Before the First African Americans. Please understand that some things I'm going to mispronounce. I'm going to do my best to not mispronounce them. So just know if I can't pronounce a name, most likely they will be an initial. All right. Okay, cool. Although we have already recounted the tale of White Lion the Treasurer and Christopher Columbus, you should know the origin story of African people in America does not begin in 1619, nor does it begin with slaves. Can you turn down a bit, JJ? I just don't want that to play in the background. In fact, the people who were kidnapped, loaded onto ships, transported across the ocean, and forced into a lifetime of human bondage were not slaves. Well, would you look at that? They were doctors, priests, children, wives, and warriors who were coerced into this racialized forced labor system through violence or the threat of violence. That they survived this legal state-sanctioned act of collective terrorism is a statement or a testament to their unextinguishable strength. But they didn't just survive. With the jagged fragments of their homeland stowed away inside their unerasable memories, they crafted a new world that not only sustained them, but also transformed this pilfered property into a place that even the white men would call home. Just as it may seem obtuse to pigeonhole Greeks English, Spanish, and Germans into a homogeneous gob of indistinguishable white people, it does a disservice to lump the different societies, kingdoms, and people together from a continent 3 times as big as Europe and just simply refer to them as slaves. The Mandinka people from the West African Mali kingdom were not the same as the Congo people, although both had civilizations and empires that made Europe's empires look like ghettos. Since the beginning of time, the condition we broadly refer to as slavery has existed in so many different iterations that it almost is unfair to sweep all the different variations of human bondage under the umbrella of one language's inadequate definition. Is a prisoner of war the same as a domestic servant? Does an unpaid worker serving a period of indentured servitude fall synonymous with a woman forced to enter an arranged marriage? Is criminal incarceration indistinguishable from mandatory military conscription? These are just a few historical examples of people who have been broadly defined as slaves. But unlike in Europe or elsewhere in the world, color based slavery was regulated as part of America's founding document. Slaves from antiquity were still seen as human, and their enslavement was not solely based on skin color. Slavery existed in Africa before white people showed up, but human beings were not commodified or chattel. In pre colonial Africa, enslaved people had legal rights. Their statues let me get back to what I was reading. I lost my place. Let's go back. But unlike in Europe or elsewhere in the world, color based slavery was regulated as a part of America's founding document. Slaves from antiquity were still seen as human, and their enslavement was not solely based on their skin color. Slavery existed in Africa before white people showed up, but human beings were not commodified or chattel. In pre colonial Africa, enslaved people had legal rights. Their status was not passed down to their children, and they did not serve as a major labor force. In fact, most of the previous iterations of human bondage around the world offered a path to freedom. To be fair, it is much easier to refer to America's unique institution as slavery than it is to call it the perpetual race-based constitutional human trafficking enterprise that legally reduces human beings to chattel through the means of violence or the threat thereof. That's quite a mouthful, but at its heart, that's what it is. And what is America? Is it a plot of dirt littered with the discarded bones of those who stood in the way of manifest destiny? Or is it a constitution? There's a footnote. Plus, Europe is not a continent. It is a dingleberry of the Asian land. She's a dingleberry of the Asian landmass. Just look at the map. In its assemblage of huddled masses yearning to breathe free, or is it merely a series of borders on a map? Was this idyllic dreamland the opportunity always here, beckoning the conquering swords of history to unearth its existence? Was it manifested from destiny out of thin air and gradually expanded across the continent like a virus? These are not rhetorical questions. To understand the history of Black people in this country, we must first come to a consensus on how we define this country. Because if what we refer to as Black history includes the jigsaw puzzle currently known as the United States of America, then the 20-something enslaved Africans who arrived in Virginia in 1619 were more than a century late to the cookout. Almost 100 years before, 104 white adventurers, as they like to call themselves, from the Virginia Company of London landed on a Virginia beach land on May 14th, 1607. Africans had already ventured to America, slaughtered natives, and built plantations. In the words of the immortal historian Ray J, we hit it first. Juan Geraldo was the first documented African American. Much of what we know about Geraldo comes from his probanza, or resume, which states that while he was from West Africa, born and raised, exploring is where he spent most of his days. Very cute. Born around 1487, Geraldo moved to Portugal before eventually landing in Spain. Converting to Christianity, changing his name to what translates as Handsome John because, of course, some researchers speculate that he was a formerly enslaved Congolese man whom someone eventually freed. In contrast, historian Ricardo Allegra believes Geraldo was the son of an African king who sent him to Portugal as an emissary. In any case, in 1503, at 15 years old, Geraldo joined explorer Juan Ponce de Leon's expedition to the New World, landing in Hispaniola. From there, Geraldo and Ponce de Leon enslaved and killed Tano around the Caribbean, searching for the fountain of wealth. There is a footnote on this page. The footnote says the fountain of youth was a myth created years after Ponce died. So they were looking for the fountain of wealth. Interesting. In 1508, Geraldo was one of about 50 soldiers, conquistadors, and enslaved men whom Ponce de Leon, whose name translates roughly as Ponce de Leon, selected to go on a gold stealing quest in the island of Burican. However, the natives that weren't down with having their wealth hijacked by newcomers who weren't from their hood, tired of the constant raping, pillaging, and enslavement of the indigenous Carib and Tano people, joined forces and went to war against the armed robbers. But by then, the traveling bandits had given the Caribbean island a nickname that inspired an influx of Spanish thieves to come searching for treasure: Puerto Rico. How could any adventurer larcenist resist the temptation of a port of riches? On April 3rd, 1513, Geraldo, Ponce de Leon, and their squad of strong-armed gangsters, still searching for a place to rob, stepped onto the shore of a new land. As they arrived on the coast, they decided to name the location in honor of the Easter season, because land of now and later colored linen suits was too hard to translate to Spanish. Ponce decided to name the land after La Pascua, Florida, the Feast of Flowers. They only stayed for 5 days, but their discovery still arguably makes Geraldo a two-time Black founding father. Ponce decided to head back to Spain and was eventually rewarded with the rights to govern La Florida and steal all its riches, on one condition: he had to read a proclamation to the natives that they were now the subject of King Carlos I. Look, I know it sounds stupid, but in the 1500s, very few process servers had ships with alternators strong enough to cross the Atlantic. So this is how white people claimed stuff. They literally just yelled out that they claimed this land, and that was it. So when Ponce showed up later with his handsome Black friend, the natives weren't as friendly as Ponce assumed they'd be. But Ponce kept trying. In 1521, Massa P pulled up. It literally says Massa P in the book. Massa P pulled up in South Florida with horses, supplies, and 200 men, intent on conquering this land. During his previous tries, Ponce had met a member of indigenous Calusa people who promised him their prospective subjects would meet the conquerors with open arms. When Ponce and his crew arrived at present-day Charlotte Harbor, the Calusa were anxiously waiting to meet their new neighbors. Ponce had barely made it through his speech welcoming the Calusa to Spanish rule when one of the Calusa warriors' housewarming gifts was an arrow dipped in the sap of one of the most poisonous trees in the known world, and it pierced his thigh. Ponce's whole staff and crew and record label hightailed it back to Cuba. And the thuggish, ruggish conquistador who brought slavery, colonialism, genocide, and death to the New World, natives died from the womb. In the first case of white splaining, Spain would blame Ponce de Leon's death on the very savage and belligerent Calusa Indians, who were not accustomed to peaceful existence. While Ponce de Leon was initiating his 5th-century plan to gentrify Miami Beach, Geraldo had hooked up with a new white friend, conquistador Hernando Cortez, and joined the Spanish conquest of Mexico. After participating in the genocide of more than 100,000 Aztec warriors, Geraldo settled in Mexico, married and had children, and eventually became the first human being to grow wheat in the Americas. Unfortunately, everyone knows corn tortillas are superior to whole wheat ones. So Geraldo's flour plantation didn't make him a wealthy man. That's when his conquistador homeboy, Cortez, tempted him with one last heist. According to Cortez, there was another island west of Mexico filled with gold, pearls, and treasure that was ruled by a tribe of black Amazon warrior women. That perked up Geraldo. Geraldo figured it was an in and out job. He and his not so good looking white friend could easily defeat a group of bedazzled quiches. So Geraldo borrowed a few bucks for the expedition and hit the seas with his Cortez, only to find a barren wasteland that had very few black Amazons. There's a footnote here. Let's read it. Footnote number 1. I'm not laughing. That's the way I cough. Footnote number 2. That we know of, colonization kind of messed up the indigenous people's records. Fair enough. Warrior women. There were no black warrior women sporting gold herringbone necklaces. Geraldo returned to Mexico broke and disappointed, and Cortez is later named the newly discovered peninsula after the mythical black pagan warrior queen, Galicia. Galicia didn't exist, but it's worth noting that a black man was on the mythical island of California nearly a century before the Mayflower left England. In 1538, dead broke with 3 kids to raise to Mexico, Geraldo submitted his claim for a pension to the King of Spain, summarizing his credentials. I, Juan, I promise I'm going to get through this. I, Juan Geraldo, black resident of Mexico, appear before your mercy and state that I am in need of making a probranza to the perpetuity of the king, a report on how I served your majesty in the conquest and pacification of this new Spain from the time when the Marquis de Val, Cortez, entered it, and in his company I was present at all the invasions and conquests and pacifications which were carried out, always with the said Marquis, all of which I did at my own expense without being given either salary or allotment of natives or anything else. As I am married and a resident of this city where I have always lived, and also as I went with the Marquis de Val to discover the islands which are in that part of the southern sea, Pacific to be exact, where there was much hunger and privation. And also as I went to discover and pacify the islands of San Juan de Birken de Puerto Rico, and also as I went to the pacification and conquest of the islands of Cuba and the Diego Velázquez, and all of these ways for 30 years have I served and continue to serve your majesty. For these reasons stated above, I do petition your majesty, and also because I was the first to have the inspiration to sow wheat here in New Spain and to see if it took. I did this and experimented at my own expense. So this was his letter to the queen to get some type of pension. Let's see if it worked. He sent this letter in 1538. By 1550, Geraldo had died. Oh, Other Africans, free and enslaved, had already made their mark on this new world. By 1521, a few months after Ponce de Leon had died from thigh poisoning, conquistadors landed on the present-day South Carolina coastline. The Spanish crew completed a preliminary survey, but to prove that they had discovered new territory, they kidnapped 60 natives and brought them back to Hispaniola. Excited about the prospects of bling, Spanish bureaucrat Lucas Vasquez de Leon wrote to Spain and assured that the crown that he wasn't as stupid as Ponce. He even took one of his captives back to Spain to testify that there was no danger in all of South Carolina. After exploring the coastline once more in 1525, Leon eventually returned to the shores of South Carolina on August 9, 1526. With him, he brought more than 600 passengers who were ready to fulfill his new colonizing contract with Spain. Along with hopeful residents, supplies, even livestock, Leon brought dozens of African slaves. One reason Leon isn't known as one of the great explorers of his time is that he was terrible at exploring. He crashed a ship and lost most of his supplies on the first day. Then, in November, the angry indigenous people joined the enslaved Africans and organized America's first slave revolt, setting fire to buildings in the settlement. Leon and his ragtag band of colonizers hopped back on their ships and jetted back to where the good, sane white people lived, leaving everything behind. Of the 600 who arrived with Leon, only 150 made it back to safety. No one knows what happened to the enslaved Africans who revolted in San Miguel de Guadalupe. Only a few returned to Leon, and most historians assume they assimilated with the Native Americans. Several tribes in North and South Carolina, including the Lumbee, trace their heritage back to a mixture of indigenous people, whites, and Africans. What we do know for sure is that both African and Native American populations have one thing in common: resistance. Juan Garrido was not the only free Black man on the North American continent. Another legendary African would prove to be more of an explorer than any of the handsome, rebellious Black Americans who came before him. And while Garrido was never a permanent resident of Florida, Puerto Rico, or California, Mustafa Azamori, who went by the street name Esteban, became a legend in places that wouldn't be called America for at least 2 centuries. Not only did he explore more of the North American continent than Lewis or Clark, but he did it before most of the Jamestown settlers were even born. A couple of months after Leon's attempted failed explorer, Narvaez departed Spain with about 600 people who intended to establish a settlement in La Florida. A merry band of land bandits that included 450 troops and slaves, along with wives, indentured servants, and navigators. Nearly 100 of Narvaez's men deserted the mission when they heard about Leon's disastrous experiment during a rest stop in Hispaniola. 60 more prospective colonizers died in a hurricane along the way, and by the time Narvaez landed near present-day St. Petersburg, he only had about 400 men. On April 13th of 1528, after making his formal declaration, Narvaez ran into a group of coastal natives. Communicating through sign language, Narvaez explained he was looking for gold. "Oh, then you're looking for the Appalachie," they told him. "They have plenty of gold." Alvar Nunez Cabeze de Vega, whose account of his adventures with Esteban forms most of the historical record, noticed that everything Narvaez told the indigenous tribe that he was looking for was followed by the revelation from the natives that the Appalachie had whatever he needed in droves. Narvaez was convinced he was going to rob the Appalachie. That's also when the Carolina gentrifiers made a crucial mistake, identifiable to anyone who has ever watched a horror movie or documentary series about the crime scene investigation team led by Scooby-Doo. They split up. Esteban knew that splitting up is the most ill-advised move in all of history. It would later cause the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and the destruction of the 5 heartbeats. I still stand by the fact that JT could actually sing better than Eddie King Jr. That's a cultural callback. You gotta know to know, babe. And if you notice, this book does not contain a single chapter about Harriet Tubman telling passengers on the Underground Railroad, you go this way, I'll go that way. A dedicated student of history will learn that splitting up ranks somewhere between let's take their land and maybe I should put this shoe polish on my face for the Halloween party. In the top 5 whitest moves of all time. But because another member of the expedition enslaved him, sorry, did Kevin come fix the door? No. Okay. Uh-oh. Anyways, here we go. But because another member of the expedition enslaved him, Esteban stayed quiet, planning ahead. Cabeza, on the other hand, tried to tell his boss that this was a bad idea. But on May 1st, Narvaez split his crew into 2 contingents. 100 sailed along the coast to find a suitable spot to set up shop, while 300 of his fighters marched through the unclaimed continent to separate the Appalachee from their gold. Along the way, they enslaved members of the tribes they encountered, stole their food, and plundered the Indian villages. The expeditionaries finally entered Appalachian territory on June 25th, immediately taking the women as hostages. Why not? Jesus. Ain't quite give the women a break, can they? Woo! Anyway, he immediately taking the women as hostages and enslaving the few men who were around. Narvaez settled down in his new territory and forced female natives to make food for his men. Before looking for gold, the new warlord made everyone else leave the village. So the conquerors would have fewer mouths to feed, and then took care of his most pressing task, declaring that the land now belonged to Spain. As soon as he began reciting his Castilian declaration of plainsmanship, the Appalachian warriors rained down arrows that easily pierced the Europeans' good armor. The Spanish were under attack. For 3 weeks, the so-called savages had the Christian warriors under siege, forcing them into desperation and starvation. Although wild game surrounded the village, the Spanish soldiers were so afraid that they couldn't even hunt. Meanwhile, Esteban was just chilling. He had no allegiance to the Spanish and was used to being hungry and terrified. So after a month of arrow dodging, the Spanish decided to make a break for it. Esteban grabbed his duffel bag and headed out too. As the conquistadors sprinted for the coast, the disgruntled natives chased them, killing every white man they saw. Not only did the Spanish get their mollywopped, but they also had to trudge through the Florida swamp hungry, goatless, and enduring showers of arrows. Cabeza and Narvaez eventually decided to retrace their steps in hopes that the Ahute, one of the tribes that had enslaved on the way, they had enslaved on the way to the Appalachee, would let bygones be bygones and offer shelter to the Spanish. But when they arrived to the Ahute village, the Indians had burned their encampment to the ground and vanished. As it turned out, there was communication between tribes up and down the coast, warning of the fleeing conquerors. And all these tribes knew that if anyone could get rid of the white bandits, the Appalachians could. They tricked y'all. They was like, go on up to that Appalachian mountain. They got all the shit. Gone up there. And the Appalachians did. They chased the Spanish to the Gulf Coast of Mexico, surrounded them, and waited while the Spanish hid along the coast, while dwindling provisions, no ships, and a few horses. Desperate, the Spanish decided to eat the horses, melt every piece of metal they owned, chop down some trees, and make rafts in hopes of escaping to anywhere. In September 22nd, Esteban's Spanish slave masters pushed 533-foot long boats into the sea. Two of the surviving rafts landed in Texas, and for 4 years, Esteban watched his white slaving army die off while he thrived. In 1532, only four of the original 600 were still alive: Esteban, Cabeza, and two other white boys. For the next 2 years, the four men traveled throughout Texas and Mexico and reached as far as New Mexico and Arizona. Ironically, Esteban proved his worth to his former enslavers by helping them escape after all. Texas natives repeatedly enslaved the colonizers during their 3,500-mile overland trek through present day Texas to New Spain or Mexico. As an Arabic speaking African who traveled with Spanish speaking Christians, Esteban displayed a remarkable propensity for language and communication. He was able to learn sign language and interact with tribes throughout the Southwest and Mexico, for saving his Spanish settlers' lives numerous times when they reached Mexico City. The Spanish rewarded Esteban with the whitest gift ever. He was re-enslaved. Oh, Esteban. You should have killed him. I'm going to take a quick break and then I'll be back and we'll finish up chapter 3.
Still don't know my words, still stressing perfection. Let you all in my mental, got me looking too desperate. Damn, you ain't desire.
I hope I haven't been on mute this whole time, child. That would be a mess. That would not be a live I would like to keep. Anyways, let's see. Let's see what Esteban been up to, child. Well, yes. When Esteban and his compadres arrived in New Mexico, or Mexico City, excuse me, they were greeted by Antonio de Mendoza y Pacheco, a viceroy, and his close friend King Carlos of Spain. Entranced by Esteban's stories, Mendoza demanded that the African be sold to him and almost certainly introduced Esteban to his two famous conquistador buddies, Hernan Cortez and Juan Garrido. Although there was no written account of Esteban meeting the only free black man in New Spain, when Cortez heard of Esteban's travels, he begged the king's permission to go gold hunting in the western part of the continent. Carlos, however, had a better idea. After receiving letters from Viceroy Mendoza gushing about Esteban el Negro, he chose Esteban to lead the unarmed contingent of indigenous Mexicans to explore the territory of north of Mexico City. Esteban, without the help of a single white man, led 100 Mexican Indians across the Sierra Madre, a feat that had been unsuccessfully attempted by every notable Spanish explorer on the continent. Along the way, Esteban seemed able to befriend every group of natives he encountered, even those who were initially hostile. Esteban supposedly met his death during this journey in 1539 at the hands of the Zuni, a tribe near the border of Arizona and New Mexico. Some non-European scholars, however, believe he may have convinced the Zuni to help fake his death so he could finally be a free man. Regardless of what happened, Esteban would eventually be erased from American history. However, Native American tribes still share stories of the mysterious black skinned man who discovered more of America than Christopher Columbus, Ponce de Leon, and Leif Erikson combined. In fact, the elders who passed down the oral tradition of Pueblo Indians in New Mexico have a distinct way to describe their first encounter with European colonizers. The first white man our people saw was a black man. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 3. So, what have we learned? Huh? What have we learned? Come on, you can tell me. What have you guys learned in the comments? Let's go over 3 questions. The first African Americans, this is multiple choice, A, discovered America, B, should be considered founding fathers, C, were not colonizers, and D, cannot be called African Americans if America did not exist. Interesting. Question number 2. What should the indigenous people of North America be called? Indians, B, pre-Americans, C, what's North America? Do you mean Turtle Island? Or D, whatever you want to be called. I say let them be called what they decide they want to be called. And number 3, who were the first settlers in America? Is it A, technically it's the indigenous people, B, the people Allion left behind, C, the colonizers who named themselves settlers, or D, all of the above? Here's a little activity for you. Colonizer or nah. On the following list of people, place a C beside the names of those who should be considered colonizers. Number 1, we're going to go 1 through 20. Esteban, Juan Guerrero, the Allion Expedition, Panfilo de Narvaez, Ponce de Leon, conquistadors, discoverers, someone who comes to your house and refuses to leave, enslaved Africans who are brought to a land against their will, squatters, a king who never set foot on your land, a king who never set foot on your land but sends someone to conquer it, a person who comes to a land and respects the laws and traditions of the people who are out there, an outsider who decides to live on an unoccupied territory, an indigenous nomad who decides to live on an unoccupied territory, a person who wants to civilize people who are already civilized, people from another country who come to steal land, people from another country who didn't steal land but enjoy the benefits of stolen land, people from another country who fund land theft operations, or finally, America. There's a little bit of an addendum here, just a little side note. So we're going to read it. And it's called The Real Wakanda. In 1324, Musa I, the 10th Mansa, or king of West African Empire, Mali, began a 4,000-mile pilgrimage to Mecca. Before his Hajj, the African and Muslim worlds had heard little about the empire and they heard little about the emperor, who united many parts of the modern-day Mauritania and Mali Mel. And Europeans had no clue who he was. But after his trip, Mansa Musa literally put the kingdom of Mali on the map. And to this very day, historians universally consider him the wealthiest human being in all of human history. Born around 1280 as Kanga Musa, a name that refers to his mother, Kanku Hamadu, Musa was born into the matriarchal Mandika society. Although his father was not a royal, Musa was appointed a deputy to the empire and assumed the throne in 1312, when the previous king took a pilgrimage to Mecca and did not return. While Europe was slowly emerging from the poverty, war, disease, and the Great Famine that killed 1 in every 10 Europeans between 1315 and 1316, Musa was building universities, mosques, and city centers throughout the empire of Mali, Instead of conquering land through war, he expanded his empire through annexation, as he used his control of gold and salt to connect desperate city states to one empire. It is said that by the end of his life, it would have taken an entire year to go from one end of the Mali Empire to the other. Because of this, Mansa earned more titles than LeBron James. He was called Emir of Mel, Lord of the Mines and Wangera, Conqueror of Granada, Mother of Dragons, Best Rapper Alive, and the Lion of Mali. The only titles that he never earned were Best Rapper Alive, Mother of Dragons, and the hardest working man in the show business. At its height, scholars say that the kingdom had 400 densely populated cities in the Niger Delta. The University of Sankor of Timbuktu, Mali, still stands where he built it after conquering the area. That was my foot.
Sorry.
Most accounts say that he took 60,000 men on his Hajj with him and balled out along the way, much to white people's dismay. Never one to be stingy with his money, Musa is reported to have handed out gold bars to poor people along his travel route. Almost every version of his Hajj tells the same story. King Musa handed out so much gold to the poor, it actually collapsed the entire gold market in the Middle East. So what did he do to fix this? In perhaps the greatest money move ever made, the king borrowed all the gold his crew could carry from Cairo. Of course, he didn't need it, but the scarcity of the precious metals settled the market. Then, like the baller he was, he simply repaid the Egyptian money lenders back, plus interest. I'm sure he also included a note that said, "My bad. I'm not supposed to be hanging, I'm not used to hanging out with a lot of broke people." This is what it says in this book. I'm not making this up.
That's a wild ass thing. You're like, you're poor. I don't like hanging out with you. Here you go. You're rich now. Take it. That's a wild ass concept.
When he returned to Mali, Musa brought back some of Spain's and Egypt's most prized architects and builders, creating an even wealthier kingdom. Mali began showing up in. Hold on a second. Historians say that by the time he returned from Mecca, he controlled most of the gold and salt in the Mediterranean. Coincidentally, this is when the kingdom of Mali began showing up on European maps. How and when Mansa Musa died is a topic of fierce debate. But in our extensive research, we could not determine whether Mansa Musa released his tax returns. We're then moving on to the next chapter. Was I reading chapter 2 or chapter 3? Child, I was reading chapter 2.
Thought you were gonna read it all the time?
Yeah, because it broke up the chapter. That's why I thought I was on chapter 3. Because it gave me like a unit review in the middle of it, But actually, I was on chapter 2 still. My bad. No, I legit was reading chapter 2 this whole time. Chapter 2 was tiny chapter. Anyways, it was like a piece of chapter 2, like a little stoppage. Let's see what the comments are saying. It is, but it's interesting. We're moving on to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is called The World Recentered. There are so many worlds. Centuries after pharaohs, emperors, czars, sultans, khans, caliphs, and kings all took turns ruling the desperate, sometimes simultaneously existing regimes that historians then and now refer to as world ruling empires, a brand new dynasty emerged in South Carolina. Just as Rome, Egypt, Athens, or Carthage are considered by ancient historians as world capitals for Black Americans, South Carolina stands as the capital of the known world. Understanding the history and legacy of Africans in America and America itself cannot begin with the tea-tossing frat boys of Boston or even the self-righteous Constitution writers of the North. America's fortune, fame, and even its independence began in South Carolina. In many ways, the Palmetto State served as the template for America's pseudo democracy, a system in which labor intelligence was stolen from West Africa and enforced by enslavement and exploitation of their peoples. South Carolina's white settlers benefited from the evolution of human bondage in Virginia. If you recall where we last left off, the Jamestown colony was on the verge of collapse because of the bumbling blue bloods that didn't know how to farm, hunt, build, or survive, and were starving to death despite having land galore. While the Brits were loving the tobacco coming their way, the colonies still weren't exactly making a profit to the point that the Virginia Company couldn't even pay its investors. They needed people that knew how and muscle to do things. But the rumors about disease, arrows to the leg, and colonizers literally having each other for dinner didn't help generate enthusiasm among working class Englanders to try out the new land. Even the poorest citizens had no desire to cross the ocean for a chance at starving to death. To solve this personnel problem, the Virginia came up with a novel solution. On November 18th of 1618, the company passed the Orders and Constitutions, which included a provision that would rescue the failed experiment. Instead of enticing workers with money, the Virginia Company's Great Charter of Privileges and Orders and Laws offered free land grants to anyone who provided funds for poor people to move to the colonies. An affluent landowner would receive the rights to 50 acres for each head they brought over, garnering as much as 200 acres for a family of four. This, my dears, is where generational wealth comes into play. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's continue. Where was I? Here we go. After a period of indentured servitude, the poor immigrants could hope to purchase land on credit from the wealthy landowners to move unreserved land and claim squatters' rights and or sell their skills to the highest bidder. There's a footnote. The standard 7-year period of indentured servitude was based on the biblical principle called the Lord's release, found in Deuteronomy 15. It's actually where Equifax got the idea from. Jesus Christ. Of course, the system was flawed. The colonizing class were perhaps the most skilled loophole finders of all time. And what these Virginians lacked in farming and survival skills, they more than made up for in the propensity for exploration. In 1638, George Menifee came up with the bright idea for how to scam his way to free land without losing his labor force after the indentured servants served their obligatory time of peonage. Menifee, a merchant, farmer, and member of the governor's council, was able to receive a patent for 3,000 acres, 1,100 of which he claimed for the Negroes I brought out of England with me. A year later, when Menifee earned another 3,000 acres for importing 60 more Africans, everyone jumped on the buy one slave, get 50 acres free bandwagon. Then, in 1662, Virginia's legislature officially sealed the fate of its Negro servants. Whereas some doubts have, hold on a second. Here's where it comes in at. Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children get by any Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free, but it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother, and that if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he or she so offending shall pay the double fines imposed by the former act. Unlike the poor English, Irish, and native indentured servants, the African imports and their children were now considered property. The black head right scheme exploded after this. In the 25 years after the colonial legislature made slavery intergenerational and perpetual, 125 land patents were approved, resulting in 1,649 Africans being shipped to Virginia. Jamestown's labor shortage was finally over, and a new system of big government handouts emerged. After all, what is capitalism if not a chance for capitalists to capitalize? By creating a legally binding, race based, intergenerational, perpetually oppressed class of human beings, Virginia revealed that all that nonsense in the colony's first chapter about God, liberty, and the true religion was a farce. Slavery was an American idea. Not a product of time. No law was passed in England that legalized slavery. France's Code Noir was similar, but it would come 2 decades after Virginia's declaration. From its inception, America was always a pyramid scheme, where the wealthy benefited from the labor of the poor. And truly, there is only one term that benefits Virginia's codified system of racial peonage: white supremacy. South Carolina would not just take note, they would up the ante by creating their own version of racial hierarchy that built on all the advances Virginia made with head rights and human chattel. In 1663, a year after slavery officially became a Virginia birthright, and over 100 years of Lucas Vasquez de Leon made his bumbling attempt to gentrify South Carolina, King Charles granted 8 Lord Proprietors the rights to establish the British colony of South Carolina and essentially rule the land as makeshift monarchs. One of the first acts of business was to enlist the British political philosopher John Locke to co-author the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. Coincidentally, Locke, who is known as the father of liberalism, and whose philosophy on the fundamental rights of life, liberty, and property inspired a little document called the Declaration of Independence, and was a major investor in the Royal African Company, the white-owned business that trafficked more enslaved Africans to America than any other entity. There's a footnote. Coincidentally means, of course, right? Locke enumerated the laws and rules for Carolina's organizing document, including a clause that would come to forever be known as Article 110, which stated, "Every freeman of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves, of what opinion or religion soever." End quote. Carolina's white supremacy was baked into the social structure as one of the colony's founding principles, and slavery proliferated. The proprietors of the Carolina Territory faced a plight similar to the situation recently overcome by Jamestown's venture capitalists. Not only did Carolina's new residents have to deal with a hostile indigenous population, but the indentured English farmers never seen a climate and soil like this. South Carolina's early white residents saw what Virginia's elite class did to the few pieces of human property and assessed it to head rights. They checked the stock price for slaves and said, "Hold my ale." The Carolina colony would build an empire of slavery. In 1672, Morris Matthews was granted several hundred acres overlooking the Ashley River, a few miles outside of England's first pre-planned city in the American colonies, Charlestown at Albemarle Point. Apologies if I got that wrong. 4 years later, Matthews gave up and sold the property to Thomas and Ann Drayton, a wealthy English couple who owned several forced labor citrus camps in Barbados. To expand their agriculture empire, the Draytons claimed head rights based on their stolen Africans still living on their Caribbean properties. Instead of transporting all their Bajan captives to Carolina, they decided to supplement their enslaved stock by abducting a few prisoners from Africa's windward coast. The Draytons' plan was impeccable. They now amassed all the free labor they needed to to build their bootleg version of Tropicana. The Drayton's plantation, Mongolia, was located in the confluence of the Ashley River, the Stono River, and the Atlantic Ocean, which made it perfectly accessible to the rest of the world. However, the brackish water made growing tobacco, vegetables, or most food staples nearly impossible on a large scale, and the porous, rich, low country soil didn't allow for the citrus farming the Draytons had mastered in Barbados. When the Draytons tried to jump the silkworm bandwagon, that failed too. As white colonists in Carolina succumbed to an outbreak of malaria and yellow fever in a tale as old as America, the Draytons began running out of time, money, and food. Curiously, the Draytons noticed their enslaved servants didn't seem a bit worried. When they investigated, the privileged, not actual planters discovered the Africans had been growing their own food, including a crop that the Draytons had never seen produced by any English laborer or white Barbadian bondsman. You want to take a guess at what that crop is? The Africans were growing rice. Rice growing is a difficult venture. Planting, growing, harvesting. The staple requires the engineering of levees, dams, and dikes. Aside from the west coast of Africa, the only regions in the world that produced rice on a large scale were in Asia and in a few in Italy. In humid climate like Carolina, it is a backbreaking prospect for fosters disease, dehydration, and exhaustion. But even in these conditions, the Drayton's stolen human class were able to persevere, saving the family from starvation and the entire Carolina economic system from collapse with the introduction of America's first edible cash crop, rice. The Draytons were not engineers, nor were they farmers. They had money, absolute power and authority over their Negro slaves, and in a sense of just how valuable it would be to grow this crop on a massive scale. So they proceeded to raid Sierra Leone and the West African rice coast to pilfer the people who would provide the knowledge and manpower to continue growing the grain that would become the South Carolina staple. My. Their genius plan had a few flaws. The slave thieves figured they could just throw a net over a few Africans and they would all magically have advanced horticulture degrees in rice growing that would directly translate to Carolina colony. Naturally, these enlightened men did not take into account that Africa, a continent larger than the United States, Brazil, Italy, and China combined, was rich with biodiversity, thereby necessitized different types of cultivation. Oh my God, look at that. In Africa, there were rice cultures, each with its own distinct botanical adaptation, according to the topography, geography, and soil. In the rain-fed uplands regions of present-day Sierra Leone and Liberia, women dropped grains into shallow holes made with the special hoe that covered the seeds with the heels of their feet. In the Senegambian swamps, growers planted rice in pottery and transferred them to swamps after the seedlings grew roots. South Carolina of Gambia River near Guinea, African agriculturalists constructed an elaborate network of embankments, dikes, canals, and sluice gates that was served to bar the entry of marine water while retaining rainfall for field saturation and rice cultivation. And in America, the embezzled empire builders from different languages, cultures, and countries were forced to adapt their ways of knowing to create an entirely new African based rice growing system that the wealthiest, most enlightened white men in the world couldn't figure out for themselves. Since the beginning of this people stealing project, the slave system relied mostly on black males who had the muscle to perform laborious tasks. And so, like in most slave societies, men greatly outnumbered women in the colonies. In Virginia's Surrey County, for instance, there were 145 men for every 100 women in the 1670s. But in the South Carolina colonies, the male to female ratio was eventually a 1-to-1 ratio. For after plantation owners realized that African women were the ones who possessed the engineering and agricultural knowledge necessary to grow what would become known as Carolina gold. Black women. In the early 1700s, Indian agent Thomas Narn observed that African women were not only capable of rice growing tasks, but they seemed to know better than the men around them. After a few calculations, Narn hypothesized that his large forced labor camp could increase his production by 50% if he put the women in the field alongside the men. Narn was right. In most West African rice societies, men rarely did any farming aside from the occasional heavy lifting. Narn would never be able to test out his hypothesis. He was tortured and killed by Yamansi natives for thinking he could negotiate a settlement after stealing their land. Still, by 1710, enslavers knew to demand the same price for African women as they did for African men, and thus the influx of women from the into the area. On Governor Robert Alston's Georgetown, South Carolina plantation, the women did most of the farming, while the men cut and hauled wood for or performed their tasks. The women were responsible for milling, dehusking, and winnowing the rice into an edible product. To achieve this, they combined West African technology with the resources available in South Carolina. They built the tools and engineered complex machinery. Instead of using palm leaves to separate rice from its hull, they used Carolina sweetgrass to weave baskets for tossing the rice in the air. They milled the rice with their handmade mortar and pestles and built the tools to turn the land. Every time these rice plantation owners imported more Africans, their empire expanded. As historian Peter Wood notes in Black Majority, with respect to rice cultivation, particular know-how rather than lack of it was one factor that made Black labor attractive to the English colonists. Some, like the Draytons, enslaved hundreds and saw their profits soar as a result. By the time the first shots of the American Revolution were fired, Magnolia Plantation had ballooned to 1,872 acres, an area twice the size of present day Harlem, with hundreds of head livestock that roamed vast acres of cow pens. When Narn was calculating the exact worth of putting his enslaved females to work, he also remarked that South Carolina abounds with cattle to a degree much beyond any other English colony. People have 1,000 head, but for a man to have 200 is very common. And just as the naturally gifted female horticulturalists, field gals, were adept at growing and harvesting rice, the South Carolinians discovered that slaves from the plains of Ghana and Gambia were skilled at herding cattle. Unlike the white buckaroos and poor crackers who use whips, the black cattlemen used salt, fire, and dogs to corral the livestock when the plantation owners needed to find them again, usually around tax time, making the cowboys as valuable as the field girl gals. Cowboys and field gals. Remember that. And as a result of their ingenuity, hard work, and savvy, these men and women died. Life on a rice plantation was so fraught with disease and death, the planters generally didn't expect their human capital to live past 19. One Charleston owner remarked that he would as soon stand 50 feet from the best Kentucky rifleman and be shot at by the hour as to spend my night on a plantation in summer. The low life expectancy, combined with an infant mortality rate that was 10 times the rate for white infants. History incessantly repeats itself. had one bright spot. On rice plantations, the high risk of catching malaria, yellow fever, or other contagious diseases meant that white people didn't bother their enslaved as much as they did on other types of plantations. Unlike those in many other slave societies, South Carolina's enslaved work on the task system. Enslaved people were responsible for their own food, clothing, and even their medical care. Each captive had a required amount of work they had to complete, and once they were done, they were released from their enslavers' oversight to work on their own gardens, sew their own clothes, and make their own money. Charleston even had an elaborate tag system that allowed enslaved people to sell goods and food at the market. From this white man free vacuum emerged a new culture and language that was a hybrid of the Africans from the Caribbean colonies, the Baga, the Fula, the Kissi, the Kipele, the Liba, the Mandinka, the Mende, and the Wolof of West Africa. They balanced the memories of their motherland on the bridges of their noses and hid them on the tips of their tongues. Their collective souls merged and became the Gullah Geechee, a cultural force that no white person would ever have power and authority over. And even the wood god near the cornstalk, Jesus and making they think that they flame. Look, yeah, Bubba, them boy know we go to the goat smelling. Ain't no churn. I've been growing, so growing with me. The Barak may be me box them in the deeps with the stingy bookie. I juke 'em till you got to toke 'em. For you got to get out, do. Tell Titi and them come by here for a bog. I and look in honey ya nana face in bout lemon, yes. Dan finna bound me with no day mouth all box up. Don't ask me what that say, because I don't know. I'm just reading it as it is. So he has a footnote to explain what it says. Furthermore, if their wooden god or their cornstalk Jesus allows them to believe in such tomfoolery, they're crazy. Pay attention, brother. Those people are aware that we would kick their asses. I'm not a child. In fact, I've been an adult for an interminable amount of time. So perhaps you shouldn't even enunciate such fantasies. These white people may force me to punch him in the mouth with their flat posterior. I punch him so hard you have to carry him home. But before you leave, please tell your sister to stop by in the immediate future and enjoy some rice perlo. Because I haven't seen her in nearly 11 years. I don't want her to curse me out and have a frown on her face. That's what they said. That's the Geechee language. During their spare time, the transplanted Africans created a whole new language by combining West African dialects, Caribbean patois, and white people's English. Geechee lingers in the way I speak to my sister and mother when they call from Monk's Corner, South Carolina. It renews itself every time. I cook a chicken bog, which is different from some perlo, the way my Uncle Junior taught me. One knuckle of water. Wait for the water to the stop busting. Stop mash it on top of it. Lower it down till you get to the little five. They said lower it down till you get to the little five. My great grandma used to call it lazy talk. But I recognize this language too. I hear it in my uncles and my aunts. They also live in North Carolina and South Carolina. But my great grandmother used to talk like this too. Make me feel like I'm at home. At the 10 minutes, watch out fire, but do not take the top off till you make your plate. You bim? A chicken bog is not the same as chicken bog. A bog is a whole thing, like a pie or a ninny. Okay, I see. And even if you're not from the South, you speak it and you don't even know it. When you bring in your own tote bag to the farmer's market, you're using a derivation of the Kikongo word tota or pickup. Thinking about checking out a movie? If you buy a box of goobers, you're using kimbundu, a word for peanut in Guba. This is where it all began, from the work of women who knew how to build, engineer, plant, and harvest. It's the food and the culture of my known world. It's coded into the culture and language of America, and Black people created it from scratch. By 1776, South Carolina was the number one exporter of rice to England, the number one supplier of salted meat to the Caribbean, and had the highest per capita income in the British colonies. And the colony that had intended to recruit white people to grow citrus was now majority Black. In the 5 years before the American Revolution, South Carolina had imported more enslaved Africans than all the other imports in all the other American colonies combined. Over the life of America's legalized transatlantic human trafficking system, 40% of this country's human imports passed through Charleston Harbor, earning the South Carolina city the title of slave capital of the New World. As they lived in these relatively insulated worlds, they had created their Creole became they had created their Creole became a tool of survival and resistance, allowing the enslaved to communicate with their fellow captives in stealth right in front of their ignorant masters. As a result, rebellion also became contagious in the culture of South Carolina's enslaved. On May 6, 1720, the Negroes of South Carolina murdered plantation supervisor Benjamin Cattle along with an unnamed white woman. An armed rebellion occurred again in 1730 in August when enslaved Africans armed themselves one Sunday morning and conspired to destroy all the whites. Three more took place on the South Carolina Rice Coast in 1739, the most famous of which occurred not far from where the Drayton's son John had just purchased the first of more than 100 properties that the intergenerational wealth bought from African labor. South Carolina's 1712 slave codes were based in the slave code of Barbados, which protected the enslaved from the cruelties and insolences of themselves or other ill tempered people or owners. But something was about to change. Somebody better box them buck run fuss loose. Ladies and gentlemen, that was chapter 3. And we have a little addendum, but I'm not going to read chapter 4. Let's read the story of Anna Nzinga, the king of queens. Historical revisionists and people who jog in place at stoplights often dismiss the impact of white supremacy and slavery by smugly reminding others, well, Africans enslaved their fellow Africans. While this is a simplistic summary of how colonialism works, the 20 and odd enslaved Africans who arrived on the White Lion in 1619 were probably from the Ndongo Kingdom in present day Angola. 5 years later, Anna Nzinga's actions would disrupt the business of the original slave traders. After the death of her father, king of Ndongo, Nzinga's brother had her sterilized and ordered her son to be killed so she would not become queen. Nzinga fled to nearby Matamba, but when her brother realized he couldn't defeat the Portuguese on his own, he begged Nzinga to negotiate a treaty. She agreed, and when she arrived to meet the Portuguese governor, they used a comic tactic to belittle her, offering her a floor mat while the European leaders looked down on her from their chairs. Unfazed, Nzinga ordered a member of her court to get on all fours and sit on his back, placing herself at their level to negotiate the treaty. Although the treaty didn't end the trade of enslaved human beings altogether, it required the removal of Portuguese forts that facilitated the slave trade. Of course, being the colonizers that they were, the Portuguese reneged on that deal and continued to take slaves and precious items from the Ndongo. After her brother died, Nzinga had her brother's son, the heir of the throne, killed. Damn. Well, I mean, he did kill her son, so that's fucked up though. And when her rival Hari teamed up with the Portuguese enslavers and declared that a woman could never control the kingdom, Nzinga fled to Matamba. She slowly increased the size of her army, kidnapped their queen and the queen's daughter, and eventually returned to Ndongo to take her throne. In 1648, Nzinga was the ruler of Ndongo and Matamba. She called herself the king. Researchers say Nzinga defied gender norms by deciding to become a man. Not only did she dress in traditional male attire, but she also required the stable of husbands to dress as women.
Ah,
Oh, Lord of mercy. I'm going to read it again for those of y'all who don't have your ears on. It says Nzinga defied gender norms by deciding to become a man. Not only did she dress in traditional male attire, but she also required her stable of husbands to dress as women. Mm, mm. Shout out to all the transgender people out there in the world. I hope y'all are having a wonderful Valentine's Day and a safe and happy life, okay? Because you are here. We see you. When the Portuguese declared war, she personally led her troops into battle and was, by all accounts, a fearless warrior and exceptional tactician. Using guerrilla warfare and implementing the war strategy of the Mbangla, Nzinga fought the Portuguese to a standstill for 30 years, all while expanding her empire. In doing so, she also declared that any African enslaved by Europeans would be free in her kingdom. When she defeated a neighboring army, she would integrate the conquering troops and force the leaders to teach her armies all their tactics, essentially creating an unstoppable force. After conquering a new land, Nzinga only had one rule for her subjects: no slave trading. Of course, this wasn't just an act of benevolence. As Nzinga's empire grew, she depleted the Portuguese supply of human chattel, which crippled their slave economy while diminishing their army. Sorry. On November 24th of 1657, the Portuguese gave up. They gave Nzinga the rights to all the land and agreed to a peace treaty. She spent the rest of her life resettling slaves, establishing trade, and reestablishing her kingdom. Nzinga lived until the age of 81. After her death, Portugal eventually reinstated its claim. 8 years later, Ndongo became part of the Portuguese Empire, but the descendants of the mother of Angola will resist colonialism forever. So let's have a little conversation, shall we? Oftentimes, when we have these conversations about slavery, about white supremacy, the narrative comes up that somehow Black people are involved or at least responsible directly for their own enslavement. So, white people can't be bad because Black people did it. So, why are you mad? The difference is that 90% of the time, we know for sure via the historians who documented not only American history, but other history across the world, that Black people were not enslaved due to the fact that they were Black. They had slaves for sure, but most of them were captured from rival tribes, just like any other place or culture around the world. Sometimes an enemy would invade the territory. You would capture them. They would become a prisoner of war. Then you had indentured servants. They became indentured servants because they owed somebody money. They may have stolen something or they may have not done a job correctly, and therefore they have been, you know, indentured into servitude. But this would not be something that was a lifetime thing where the person were owning another person. They were indentured to doing work to pay off a debt. That is a big difference from chattel slavery. Okay. The difference in what we're talking about is that the African tribes had no idea what they were doing with the slaves once they were sold into captivity. They assumed that they would be able to work and move the same way that they do in Africa. They had no other reason to distrust them. Unfortunately, that was a big mistake. No one, however, absolves African people of their part in this particular slave trade. The problem is when people do not want to take accountability or at least accept the fact that their ancestors were the most horrible and horrendous things to Black people specifically, that's where the problem comes in. And that's where the lack of communication comes in. This isn't about you per se as a white person. This is about what the country that we all live in has done to us as Black people, as well as everyone else who does not fit the mold of what they deem to be right for America. Black history is American history. And every time I read a chapter out of this book, this live will say reading and chill Black as fuck history. You get mad when you are not the focus of attention, when you're not the one who gets to have all of the love and admiration. But when I'm now telling you what I'm reading and speaking the truth, then I get shit like this. I get it's inappropriate for content and title. I get how many countries are in Africa. You tell me, you seem to have an idea of how many countries are in Africa. Moral of the story is, people, please read. You learn so much when you read. Reading allows you to learn, obviously, but it also gives you context. And in this book, you're learning about how Black people settled, how there were other settlers and colonizers coming to the Americas way before Christopher Columbus, that he never discovered anything. And you also learn how much of a dummy he actually was and how much Vespucci was a dummy. Everybody that we're listening to were just dummies. They literally took other people's knowledge, other people's skill and talent, and used it to their advantage and gain because they had money. That does not mean you're smart. It means that you're a parasite, a virus. You maneuver by however it can make you money. You steal and you pilfer. That is also a part of America's history. And you can't learn about the good parts and then run away from the bad. I'm sorry. That's just the actual factuals. There's really nothing you can do about it. Reading is knowledge and knowledge is power. It is. But I loved the story about Nzinga. Now, if you didn't come in when I was reading about Nzinga, she was basically an African warrior princess who came, conquered, and stole. And that lady said, I'm not conforming to your gender bullshit. I'm going to dress like the man you wish I was. And every man that I'm with going to dress like the woman I want them to be. I wish they had. I'm gonna find some books on her because I really, because what that does is give you some true background. Oh, uh-oh. Like I like that. Because what that does is give you some true background into how the gender norms were not always black and white. There were some gray areas well before what we know now. I found a picture of her. Wow, she was really pretty. Hey, she was a Sagittarius like me. No wonder I like her. I'm gonna show y'all what Queen Anna looked like. Hold on. Hold on, guys. Hold on. Excuse me. You run my name through the mud. Why the I don't get you? Not the Sagittarius. I mean, I guess this is what Queen Anna looked like, the warrior queen. This is what she looked like, or at least this is the depiction of her. We are still in chapter 3 here. We're going to finish up chapter 3 next time and move into chapter 4. We read 2 chapters today, 2.5 chapters today, or 1.5 chapters today. The next chapter is called Survival and Resistance, the Black American Revolution. We're moving through this book pretty well. We're not halfway through, but we're doing pretty good. So, if you want to read Black as Fuck History on your own time, or you want to read along with me, then you can head over to Amazon and Barnes and Noble and get this book. It's currently available right now, and you can have your own copy. That way you don't have to feel like you're stuck where I'm stuck, and you can read ahead and just come in and we can have a full book club about the book that we're reading and what we're talking about. I want you guys to be well informed, and it's time that we start going back to basics when it comes to knowledge. Not everything is going to be able to come from TikTok videos, Instagram reels, and YouTube videos. Even though I'm one of those people, I'm also not just telling you the information. I'm reading it to you word for word, book for book. And just so I can encourage you to start reading, I really want you to go and pick up your own copy and read it for yourself. If you're not a good reader and you would rather listen to the book, then I would suggest you get a Audible membership, or there's a couple other audiobook libraries out there for you to invest in. But I want you guys to go and pick this book up because it's well written. It's easier for you to understand, and the history is there. It just needs to be put out there for everybody to see. This is one of the books that they banned, if I recall, due to the title. Run my name through the mud. Wipe that dirt off your shoes. Yep. Black as Fuck History is one of the banned book lists. One of the banned books on the banned list. Because it is targeted due to its often humorous and unwhitewashed account of American history. And this challenges very traditional narratives about slavery, race, and white supremacy. This book is restricted in schools, and it reflects on a broader nationwide effort to censor books on race and Black history, particularly in the states like Florida. So this is one of the banned books, and now you see why it was banned, because it gives you the history with no filter, but it gives it to you in a nice way so that you can understand it. I highly recommend that you go and pick this book up because it's really, really interesting and it's well written. I'm going to continue reading it every Saturday as long as there's no PLE. We're going to come over here, we're going to sit back, and we're going to read. And if I feel like it, I'll come back on here on Sunday and I'll read. Now, what will happen on days that I just simply cannot do reading and chill for Saturdays, I will pre-prepare the video for you and it will go up like a live on Saturday, and you guys can just come in and listen to me read and rant about what I've learned in this book. Okay, so we'll do it that way. If I can't come in live that day, I'll make sure I pre-record the next week and get it up. My husband's birthday is next week, so that will be a pre-recorded video that will go up next Saturday, because I'm not going to be spending time with y'all on my husband's birthday weekend. I'm just not doing that. Love y'all, but not that much. Okay. Anyways, I will see y'all live the week after next on Saturday. What? No, because wait, ain't the week after next? Oh, bitch, that fucking Elimination Chamber.
Elimination Chamber is the week after my birthday.
Yeah, so y'all can get 2 weeks of a break from Reading and Chill, at least the live episodes. After that, the first week of March is where we'll pick back up with Black as Fuck History and finish reading out the chapters. But I'm going to read a couple chapters in the recorded videos. And what I'll do is next week you'll get a recorded video, and the week of the 28th, you'll get a recorded video on Sunday. That way you guys won't feel like you missed anything, and we can keep everything rolling. All right? And don't worry, there is a new episode of Wrestle Eats coming out. And this episode is Kurt Angle's episode, because Kurt Angle loves spaghetti. So we're making spaghetti, and I'm gonna show y'all how my family makes it. Okay, I'm gonna pre-reference this shit right now. I don't put a hell of amount of sugar in my spaghetti. I seen bitches taking bags of sugar and dumping half of the bag of sugar in spaghetti. Your spaghetti should not be sweet, ho. I cannot scream this loud enough. You should not have sweet fucking spaghetti. Get y'all shit together. Y'all is out here serving spaghetti that tastes like candy. What's wrong with y'all? Who told you to do this? No, ma'am, Pam. But we're going to make it. We're going to film it. And then I'm going to make sure we edit it and get it posted next week. And you guys will see how I would make spaghetti for none other than the Olympic gold medalist who won a medal with a broken freaking neck. I'm going to show y'all how we are to make him spaghetti. And we're going to make some garlic bread and a nice little salad on the side. It's going to be real short. It's going to be real nice. Make sure y'all follow me for that video. We're going to edit and post it next week in the middle of the week. I think we're going to post it on a Wednesday right before I go live, so you'll get a 2 for that day. We have a good time. I promise y'all these next couple of weeks are going to be very interesting. All right? So thank y'all so much for coming over here to Reading and Chill. I will see you guys again live for Reading and Chill on the first week of March, which is the 7th. That is when I'll be back live for Reading and Chill. By then, we should be on chapter 6, maybe 7. Okay? So we're going to be moving right along. All right? Love you guys to death. Make sure you subscribe. Okay? Make sure you rate, comment, and subscribe. It is imperative. And also share the video. It's important that you share it. Thank you guys so much for coming over here and listening to me fumble over people's names and words. I love you to death. Happy Valentine's Day. And if you didn't have a Valentine, don't worry about it. It's not the end of the world. I'll see you guys Monday after Monday Night Raw. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe for more wrestling content. Check out our merch and consider becoming a member for exclusive perks, special emojis, and members-only content.